say, here's a lesson you don't get. I said, I loop the loop when I get loose. I said, ignition, ignite your night out.
Hello and welcome to episode 1 of the Not Fade Away podcast. I am your host, Margot D, and you might know me from my other shows I co-host and produce, including Book vs. Movie, The Fit Bottom Girls, and the Best Neighbors podcast. Or maybe not. Maybe you just happened upon the show doing a random search about today's subject. Either way, I am so glad you are joining me today. This podcast aims to show respect to those in the music world who are no longer with us. This will include musicians, singers, songwriters, artists. If they had something important to do with the music world, I will cover them. You can find the show on wherever you find your podcasts under the name Not Fade Away Podcast. And you can find me on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Not Fade Away Podcast. And feel free to email me with comments and suggestions to notfadeawaypodcast@gmail.com. A couple of things before we start the show today. A big old shout out to Dina of Twisted Philly. What up, Dina? She designed the logo for this show, which she took from my own personal archive. So if you love true crime and have a wicked sense of humor, definitely check out her show, Twisted Philly. Believe me, you will thank me later. Also, I do not have the music rights just kind of lying around my apartment to pay for all the music that it's going to take to be on these shows. I really wish I could, and I'm really hoping one day to get an awesome sponsor so I can really jazz it up. So instead, I'm going to be using interviews and films clips and news clips and things like that in order to give context to each episode. All right, now let's get this first episode off the ground. Alternately known as the Lizard King in Mr. Mojo Rising, James Douglas Morrison in the span of a few short years went from unemployed film school graduate to a world-renowned rock star, and then tragically joined the now infamous 27 Club. More on that later. At one point, he was the king of the Sunset Strip, but when he died under rather mysterious circumstances in 1971, more on that later, his stardom went from notorious bad boy rocker to drunken spectacle to now legendary poet and sex symbol. As crass as this is to say, dying young really cemented Jim as an Adonis for the ages. After the insane popularity of author Danny Sugarman's No One Here Gets Out Alive in 1980, more on that later, there have been literally dozens of books and documentaries about Jim and his brothers in the Doors. Plus, let's not forget that really super cheesy and ridiculously enjoyable biopic directed by none other than Oliver Stone, simply called The Doors. I was an extra in that movie, by the way. I might dive into that later. Jim's fame has never dimmed in the popular culture, and he is still used as a symbol of rebellion and sexiness, as you can tell from these clips from The Simpsons and Jimmy Fallon's Reading Rainbow.
We found this one swimming naked in the fermentarium.
I am the Lizard Queen!
Give her this, and then these.
Oh, thank you, Doctor.
No, I'm not a doctor.
I just want to let you guys know that the logo for the show is from a photo taken in the summer of '94 when I made my own pilgrimage to Jim's burial site, the Père Lachaise Cemetery. This is also the final resting place for Chopin, Molière, Oscar Wilde, and Edith Piaf. Not too shabby company, right? By the way, I do have two special guests for the podcast. One is my friend Andrea, who saw The Doors in 1967. And then there's Justin of the American Crime Cast, who will clue us in on the details of Jim's passing and the various rumors that persist about him to this day. All right, now on with the show.
22 years old, occupation, guitar. Name? John Dinsmore. 23, occupation, percussionist. Name? Raymond Daniel Manzo.
Jim Morrison was born December 8th, 1943, to his father, a lifelong Navy man, George Stephen Morrison. He went by the name Steve, by the way, and his mother, Clara. Jim also had two younger siblings, Andrew and Ann. Jim's father was a very big deal in the military. He was stationed at Pearl Harbor and was there on the day of the attacks, as a matter of fact. He was also a fighter pilot during World War II and the Korean War, and rose to the rank of Rear Admiral of the USS Bonhomme Richard, known as the Bonnie Dick. He was also at the Gulf of Tonkin conflict, which was a key event in the Vietnam War. Two things really made an impact during Jim's childhood. One, his parents did not believe in corporal punishment, hitting or spanking their kids, but instead engaged in what the military would call a dressing down of the children when they got out of line. So what is that? Basically, that's a person making you stand at attention and screaming in your face until they break you down, telling you how bad you are, how you should be ashamed of yourself, that kind of thing. That really messed with Jim's head. And the second thing that happened was that he was very young. His family was on a car trip going through New Mexico, and apparently they came upon a car accident filled with Native Americans the bodies were strewn across the street. It was bloody. It was really psychically damaging to Jim, and he never forgot it. And actually, he includes lyrics in future songs about that event. Growing up, Jim was an excellent student who loved books and reading just about anything. And here's a clip. I'm going to go to it a few times. It was an excellent documentary called When You're Strange, and it featured a very rare interview with Jim's father, Steve, who, by the way, died in 2008, and his sister, Ann. And here they are describing what Jim was like when he was a kid.
Jim was a very intelligent, bright young man, and behaved himself pretty well, really. And he liked to write and draw pictures.
He was an avid reader. He read everything, and then he also wrote. He would write he had a book, and this was in high school, he would learn a new word, and then he would write a whole story around it. So his vocabulary was incredible.
He liked all the classics and read everything he could get his hands on. And he was always delighted to go to his grandmother's house because she had a library.
One time he just got up out of class and told his teacher he was going to have a brain tumor removed, and he just walked out of class to go read. When he graduated from high school, he asked my parents for the complete works of Nietzsche.
So in high school, Jim thoroughly impressed his teachers with his vocabulary and rabidly curious mind. And in fact, his junior year English teacher recalls Jim was bragging about reading these 15th and 16th century books on demonology. And the teacher thought this was absolutely preposterous and had a buddy of his with access to the National Archives look up the titles Jim claimed to have read. And wouldn't you know it, each and every book actually did exist. Also in his teenage years, Jim was discovering his rebellious side with alcohol, music, and women. Basically the three things he cared about most for the rest of his life. Despite his truancy and bad boy leanings, Jim did graduate high school in Alexandria, Virginia, and decided to move back to Florida to start junior college. He moved in with his grandparents in Clearwater and tested their patience with his frequent bouts of drunken behavior. In 1962, Jim transfers to Florida State University in Tallahassee. Fun fact here, on September 28, 1963, Jim is arrested for the first time in his life for being drunk at an FSU football game where he was taunting the players. And yet, despite all of his shenanigans, Jim manages to make the dean's list. However, Jim is now fascinated by a new type of academia, wherein the student could know just as much as the teacher, which really greatly appealed to him. In 1964, he transfers to UCLA and enrolls in the prestigious film school. There, he meets his future bandmate, Ray Manzarek, and later he graduates in 1965. Now, Jim's family thought he would get a job in Hollywood and work for a film studio. Actually do something with that degree that they spent all their money on. But Jim told his friends, however, that inspired by the beats like Jack Kerouac and Allen Ginsberg, he instead planned to move to New York City and make his living as a writer. Now, in fact, he did neither. Inspired more by the bohemian culture of the time, Jim was instead living on rooftops in Venice Beach, California, surviving on baked beans and LSD. One day in May of 1965, he ran into Ray Manzarek and they talked about music. Raymond Daniel Manzarek was a really interesting dude. Growing up on the south side of Chicago, the son of immigrant Polish parents, actually Ray's first love was basketball. But when his high school coach told him he could no longer play guard, he quit the team and formed a band with his brothers Rick and the Ravens. Now, in a brief stint with the Army, where Ray basically was selling pot and performing in bands, he refused to sign a security clearance and was discharged right before the Vietnam War became intense. After graduating from UCLA Film School, Ray was looking for a new adventure and definitely found it with Jim. Instead of working, Jim was spending his days getting high and composing song lyrics. So Jim sang him a few bars of Moonlight Drive, and Ray was like, dude, we need to get a band together. At the time in the 60s, the Transcendental Meditation Movement, or TM, was really taking off in the counterculture, and Jim and Ray were totally into it. And so they go to this TM lecture, and there they meet drummer John Densmore and guitarist Robbie Krieger, and they decide to form a band. And John Densmore would later say, without TM, there would be no Doors. The band decides to name themselves The Doors after the Aldous Huxley book, The Doors of Perception. Now, around this time, Jim is letting his family know of his plans to be a musician, which did not exactly go over well with his parents. Here's a clip of Jim's dad again.
When he ended up in rock music, I was absolutely flabbergasted. Well, he called me on the phone, said he was going on the road with a rock band. And it took me a little bit to gathering what he was really saying, but then, sure enough, that's what it was. And I told him that's ridiculous, that you're not a singer, you can't sing. And I told him he was really, I said, you are on the wrong track here. Get yourself a job. That to me was not a job.
But Jim is stubborn and will not be deterred by anything, including his total shyness on stage. And this is really hard to believe. But at the beginning of his career, Jim was so bashful, he would perform with his back to the audience the whole show, really. In the summer of 1965, Jim moves in with Ray and Dorothy. Dorothy works to support them while Jim and Ray work on songs at the UCLA music rooms. And then that was during the day. And then at night, the band would come over and they'd have rehearsals until late into the night. At this time in history, young men Jim's age were terrified of being drafted. This guy grew up in a military family, and he had no illusions on what it meant to live that regimented lifestyle. He was not exactly a fan of authority, as we know. So like many others, Jim showed up at the draft office looking disheveled and telling them he had homosexual tendencies. So basically, he didn't have to be worried about being shipped off to war. So from now on, I'm going to be talking year to year because so much happens in the next 6 years. There's so much to get in. So here we go, 1966. It's January 23rd, and Jim and some of his buddies, not the band, are traveling to Mexico to look for peyote because why not? Jim finds a girl standing by the side of the road and impulsively jumps out of the car and kisses her, again, because why not? Well, her male friends were not exactly happy about this gringo moving in on their chick, so they chase the car down and they basically beat the living crap out of Jim and his buddies. So Jim and his buddies head back to LA, and Jim and one of his friends have a big time argument, and his friend calls him an asshole. So when he gets back to LA, Jim decides to tell people he killed his friend in the desert and left his body there. Why? Who knows? But the kid's family is pissed, and they file charges against Jim for assault. Jim is actually eventually arrested for kissing the 14-year-old girl, 14, against her will. But the charges later are dropped. In February, they have their first real gig at the London Fog Club in LA, and this is where Jim meets the love of his life, Pamela Corson. Pamela was this party girl from Southern California. You know, she kind of went from band to band to band, and she and Jim really, really loved each other. They had a very tempestuous relationship, but she was the one in the end who was considered his common law wife. In June 1966, the band have graduated to the infamous Whiskey A Go-Go and are signed to Elektra Records. For the rest of the year, Jim manages to stay out of trouble while the band writes and records their first album. Well, except for the time he broke into the recording studio in the middle of the night, dousing the place with a fire extinguisher, but hey, he didn't get arrested for it, did he? January 4th, The Doors' self-titled first record is released, and it's an immediate hit with both fans and critics, featuring songs like Light My Fire and Break On Through. Interesting trivia here, The Doors was actually the first rock band to have their music featured as a billboard on the Sunset Strip. That became later a staple of marketing, but at the time, The Doors were the very first. So Jim was really proud of this effort and sent a copy of this record to his family. And let's just say they were less than impressed with what they heard. Jim's father sent him a very formal letter telling him he had no talent for singing and should just quit The Doors right away, just quit the band. This was a breaking point for Jim. He was really so angry about this feedback that he never spoke to either parent again. From then on, in interviews with the press, Jim insisted he was an orphan. One time his mother tried to reach him at the hotel in a town where he was staying, and he had her turned away. Jim's parents felt the sting of this rebuke for the rest of their lives. Here's a clip of Jim's dad again.
I haven't even heard the lyrics. I've heard the titles like Light My Fire. That's about it. And what it goes on after that, I couldn't tell you. I'm afraid I'm a very poor interpreter of his talent.
My dad was in the Navy. He was still an admiral, and he had his own life. And I think Jim knew that this would be an issue with my parents. And I think he just separated himself completely.
So it's the summer of 1967, and the pop culture scene in San Francisco is getting a ton of press attention everywhere. It's the land of hippies and freaks, and it was dubbed the Summer of Love. The Doors spent their weekdays working on their second record, and yes, that's right, just 6 months after releasing their first record, they're working on their second record. That's how bands used to work back then. They recorded all the time. Anyway, every weekend they would promote their music by putting on shows around the country, and they got this reputation for being a really fantastic live band. That summer in 67, my friend Andrea saw them live in San Francisco, and I asked her to tell me what it was like, and she said she would agree to this recording. So she's going to tell us about what it was like to see the Doors live, and I have to just give you guys a warning. She lives in kind of a remote spot in Utah, so this was the best recording I could get for her, but I hope you enjoy it.
Andrea P., and I saw the Doors in 1967 in San Francisco at the Fillmore. I was 17. And I saw them with the Velvet Underground. And I made a black cape with satin lining to wear because I just thought that would be cool. And Jim Morrison ended up on the floor, on the ground, on his back, with his hand in his pants, of course. So I don't know what was going on there because, I was a little further back, but he was known to do strange things on stage. I went with a boyfriend at the time,
Mm-hmm.
and it cost like $3.50 to get in back then. I think it was $3.50 or $4. Is that insane? But he was good. They were really good. 67 almost. That's a long time ago.
I was going to say, I'm impressed you remember that.
Oh, barely though. I mean, I'm like, really? Did I really see them? Yes, I did. But I never met him. I met a lot of other people, but they were a little difficult to get close to or, at that time. I didn't really try either because I had a boyfriend. So
Sure.
I guess if I had been with my girlfriends, it would have been different. But, it was fun. It was always interesting.
So now here we are, September 17th, 1967, and the Doors have landed a spot on The Ed Sullivan Show, which was a weekly national variety program on CBS TV. Just some background here. Between 1948 and 1971, The Ed Sullivan Show could make an unknown a superstar overnight. It basically cemented the reputations of the Rolling Stones, James Brown, and even the Beatles. And yes, it was a variety show in the truest sense of the word. I mean, they had dog shows, and they had ballerinas, and they had spinning plates. It was a variety show, but all the cool singers and bands wanted to be on that show because they had millions of people in their living rooms watching them around the country. So the Doors are there to perform Light My Fire, which was the huge hit of the summer, and are asked to change their lyrics to get rid of any of that drug connotation that it had. Now, here's a scene from that Oliver Stone film talking about what that probably sounded and looked like at the time. Check it out here.
Great, fine. Just really good, fine.
Well, I have one little thing to bring up. It's a small thing, but it's important. The guys at Network have told us that they have a little problem with one of your lyrics, the lyric, girl, we couldn't get much higher. See, because you can't say higher on Network, so they asked if you could say instead, girl, we can't get much better. Can you dig that?
How about, girl, you couldn't bite my wire?
I don't think standards and practices would.
And fellas, why don't you have a nice big smile on your face when you get out there? There's no point in being sullen. You know what I mean? Well, just do it.
Kind of sullen group, Ed.
You boys should know Mr. Sullivan is considering you boys for 4 more shows. You dig?
We dig, and I'm going to work it out. Just give me 5 minutes, okay?
Okay.
All right,
Groovy.
It's groovy. Just give me 5, okay?
Have a great show, okay?
Oh, come on, John. It's just a word, Jim. Stones changed when they played here. Yeah. don't you change your name to, Sydney or Irving Manzarek? It's just a word. Hey, man. My words, I don't care. Let's just jam.
And now, direct from Los Angeles, California, ladies and gentlemen, here now, The Doors.
You know that it would be untrue.
We're okay sound-wise. Okay.
Two-truck black.
If I was to say to you, girl, we couldn't get much higher.
Yeah. She said it. She said it on national TV. I can't believe that. What's that? Oh, Jesus, get off it. You can see his thing. Yo, you blew it, you little shit. You'll never play Sullivan again.
On September 25th, the band releases their second album, Strange Days, and that features the songs The Alabama Song, People Are Strange, and Love Me 2 Times. In December, we have Jim getting arrested once again. This is December 9th in New Haven, Connecticut. Jim is backstage for the show, making out with a girl in a shower stall. Now, this is not with his girlfriend, Pamela. This woman is either a groupie, a reporter, or the daughter of a policeman working that night. I really just can't get confirmation on who it was. But whoever it was, Jim is confronted by a cop who tells them to leave the shower stall. He doesn't recognize Jim as a lead singer of The Doors. And Jim being Jim, he just tells him to eat it. And the cop gets pissed, and he takes his can of mace out and sprays Jim directly in his face. The Doors manager, Bill Siddons, comes in and helps Jim flush his eyes out and explains to the cop, it's really not a good idea to spray the headliner of the show in his face right before he has to go on stage. And the cop does apologize, but the die has been cast, and Jim is pissed. He's ruminating on this before he goes on stage and is visibly getting angrier and most likely drunker as the evening progresses. During Backdoor Man, Jim is getting increasingly vulgar and making disparaging remarks about the cops who were there on the stage with the band. Back then, cops would be on stage just sort of patrolling the edges as the band played, and you would be surprised how low the stage was. It was really easy to get on stage with a band back then. I can't imagine how frightening that was. Anyway, Jim is basically taunting the police to do something about his smart mouth, so they arrest him right then and there on stage. Well, this sets off a shitstorm as the crowd goes nuts while their hero is being dragged off stage by several police officers. People go crazy. There are eventually 13 arrests, but later on, all those charges are dropped. 1967 ends on a more joyful note when Ray and Dorothy are married on December 21st in Los Angeles, and Jim and Pamela are their witnesses. They would stay married until Ray's death from cancer in 2013. Now we are in 1968, January 28th. Jim is arrested in Las Vegas at the Pussycat A Go-Go this time. He's there pretending to be smoking a joint right in front of security, and they don't like it. So they throw him in jail. He basically gets out. And he kind of sort of stays out of trouble for the next few months while they're recording the Waiting for the Sun record. But there's this one time at the Scene in New York City in March where he really makes a total ass of himself. So the Scene was this nightclub known for its bluesy atmosphere. And one night in March, Jim was in the audience along with Jimi Hendrix and Janis Joplin. Now, they weren't seated together. They were all seated separately from each other. But that tells you how cool this place was. Jimmy decides to go on stage and jam with the band. And Jim is having so much fun listening to them that he kind of crawls up on stage and tries to join in and sing with them, but he lost his voice. So instead of adding cool vocals, Jim drunkenly falls around the stage, flailing on the floor, and starts grabbing Jimi Hendrix by the ankles. Jimi Hendrix is pretty pissed about this, so he kicks Jim and knocks Jim back, and Jim falls into Janis Joplin's table and spills her drinks all over her. Sad to say, this is not the only time Jim makes a drunken spectacle of himself in front of Janis Joplin. They kind of did that in front of each other, apparently, off and on over the years. So now we are in the summer of 1968, and the band releases Waiting for the Sun, with the best-known tracks being Hello, I Love You, Love Street, and 5 to 1. And despite Jim's increasing alcoholism, and it is becoming a huge issue for everyone, the Doors are enjoying a stellar reputation as a live band. So July 5th, they play a great set at the Hollywood Bowl, which will eventually become a best-selling live album for them and a movie that showcases them at their peak. The rest of 1968, the band is recording The Soft Parade, which was fraught with more infighting on what Jim wanted to produce and what the other band members wanted to create. Jim is making it clear he's more interested in his poetry and the arts. He doesn't want to be a strictly old-school rock and roll band kind of anymore. He doesn't want to do that anymore. It's also at this time that the band members are now taking sole credit for the songs being produced versus before all four members would list their names for every song. That now they're all just doing it on their own. So here we are in 1969. In February, Jim is arrested for drunk driving and driving out of license in Los Angeles. In March, we have something that's simply known as the Miami incident. Here is a news clip.
President of the Greater Miami Crime Commission, I'm calling upon the Dade County Grand Jury and the State Attorney's Office to immediately take criminal action against those that were responsible for the deplorable condition and situation that occurred at the Dade County Auditorium this past weekend, when the group known as the Doors, the rock and roll group, attempted to precipitate a riot. This situation is a blot upon our community and those that are responsible for profiting as a result of depravity and immorality as occurred here, and where you have children from 9 to 14 years of age being subjected to such obscenities. Certainly immediate action is demanded, and we are demanding that action this day.
We have taken out 2 warrants for Jim Morrison. One of them is for indecent exposure. The other is for the use of obscene languages during his performance at Dinner Key Saturday night. We have been delayed on issuing these warrants because we had to wait until we were able to get a copy of recordings that were taken by public-minded people who attended this performance. And also, we were hoping to get pictures that were taken during the performance.
On March 1st, the Doors are scheduled to play a gig at the Key Auditorium in the Coconut Grove section of Miami. And this thing turns into a whole shit show from conception to the awful end. Here's what we know. The Key Auditorium used to be a seaplane hangar, but that night became a concert venue because rock concerts made a crazy amount of money at that time. So people would just take any kind of space and turn it into a theater. All the seats were taken out to sell more tickets. So this place normally would fit like 7,000 people. They took all the seats out and they made 12,000 people go in there. Okay, that was the venue. They had no air conditioning, and the Doors were so popular that people were scaling the walls and sneaking in to get a glimpse of them. So it's overpopulated right from the start, and you know it's going to be a mess. Here are a few key things you need to know about this infamous gig as well. Before this, Jim had recently seen an experimental play with actors that acted antagonistically towards their audience. Kind of think of Andy Kaufman-ish kind of level weird, right? So Jim was intrigued with the idea of pushing the limits of the audience's patience. Jim also was drinking the entire day on March 1st and was delayed flying from New Orleans to Miami, which caused the show to start over an hour late. He was supposed to be getting back from a relaxing vacation with his girlfriend Pamela, but they had a huge fight just before they took off on that trip, and he actually was still really mad about it. Also, manager Bill Siddons realized the promoters were ripping the band off that night by taking twice as much as normal of their cut, and was basically told by them, yeah, so what? What are you going to do about it? So under these conditions, mayhem ensued. Jim was having a really rough night that night. His voice is shot. He was most likely drunk or hungover or dehydrated, or all three at this point. He's beginning to rant at the audience and then seeming wanting them to join him on stage. Here's a clip of Jim that night. It's pretty rough to listen to, but it gives you an idea of his state of being.
Now look at here. I ain't talking about no revolution. And I'm not talking about no demonstration. I'm talking about having a good time. I'm talking about having a good time this summer. Now you all come out to L.A. You all get out there. We're gonna lie down there in the sand and rub our toes in the ocean, and we're gonna have a good time. Are you ready? 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 Are you ready?
Then someone gets the bright idea to jump on stage and pour champagne on Jim Morrison. He takes his shirt off and invites the crowd to strip. And at this point, things get a little weird. Jim is carrying a sheep around for a little bit under his arm. And then another point in the show, he's simulating performing oral sex on Robbie Krieger. It's crazy. The next thing that occurs is legendary in that no one seems to know what really happened. But basically, Jim is accused of exposing himself to the crowd. So the cops had had enough at this point, and they arrest Jim right on the stage. The audience goes batshit crazy, and eventually there are 6 warrants issued against Jim, including indecent exposure, lewd and lascivious behavior. Here's a clip of the more conservative teens who went to the show that night.
It was a bad scene, and like I say, it was completely unwarranted, uncalled for in all parts.
I think that the exhibition Dinner Key Auditorium Saturday night was really shocking, and from talking to the kids, the ones that attended it were sorry that they did, and the ones that didn't were glad. And I just want to know if anyone has the courage enough to stand up and do something about the trash that's being brought into Miami.
I talked to some of the guys that went. I myself did not go to this and not participate because I feel it's not really good entertainment. I've heard that the Doors, they got kicked out of other places because of the riots and their indecent exposure and they're talking, and I feel that we have to do something about this. This is real disgusting. And how my children, when I grow up and have children, do I want them in an environment like this? I mean, is this progress or are we decaying in a way?
The band is offered a chance to play a free show to make this all go away, but Jim wants to go to court and prove his innocence. He really feels he did absolutely nothing wrong. He did nothing worse than put on a really sloppy performance. So he really wants to go to court. He's adamant about it. After Miami, several shows are canceled in 1969, and the band is noticeably not present at the Woodstock concerts in August. In July 1969, The Soft Parade is released. In November, Jim is arrested for interfering with a flight crew at the Sky Harbor Airport in Phoenix. It is clear that Jim really needs to take a break. Fast forward to 1970. In February 1970, Morrison Hotel is released with the singles Roadhouse Blues and Peace Frog, and it's doing very well with both fans and critics. They even managed to pull off a few successful gigs in Europe, including London's Hyde Park. But Jim is starting to look tired and spent on stage. He's gaining weight and looks puffy and unkempt with his scraggly beard and his shaggy hairdo. In April, he releases a book of poetry, The Lords and the New Creatures. In July, Absolutely Live is released. And that was that show I talked about before at the Hollywood Bowl, and it does really, really well. However, on September 18th that year, Jimi Hendrix dies from drugs and alcohol at the age of 27. Now, I mentioned this before, the 27 Club. It's a horrible name for a horrible thing. It just so happens to be the age that many famous musicians died, including Jimi Hendrix and Janis Joplin, who dies on October 4th of 1970. It's also the age that Kurt Cobain died, Amy Winehouse, Brian Jones, and eventually Jim. Also in September of 1970, Jim is tried and convicted of the Miami business and is sentenced to 6 months in jail with hard labor plus a $500 fine. He's released upon appeal, and this whole nonsense basically weighs on him the rest of his life. Eventually, he's given a posthumous pardon in 2010 by Governor Charlie Crist. On December 8th, Jim turns 27. On December 12th, the band gives their final live performance as a group, which by all accounts was a total shit show once again. It takes place at the Warehouse in New Orleans, which was one of Jim's favorite cities and venues. But Jim is heavy and sluggish. He can't remember the lyrics. He's alternately slumped against the drum riser and throwing the mic into the floor. He leaves the show early, and the band just kind of wanders off the stage after him. And it's really a pathetic end to what was once a really amazing live band. So here we go to 1971, and producer Paul Rothschild leaves the band because he thinks the new songs are kind of crappy, like Love Her Madly he describes as cocktail music. So the band asks Bruce Botnick to take over, and they decide to record every track in one room all together and basically knock out one of the best albums in their catalog, LA Woman. They record the album in 1 week, by the way, and it has hits like Riders on the Storm, LA Woman, Love Her Madly, and my favorite, The Wasp. It's a fantastic way for Jim to end his recording career for now, as he decides to take a sabbatical to Paris. April 15th, Jim moves to Paris with Pamela to rest and recharge and work on his poetry. He was done with being a rock star, and he just wanted to be known as more of as a talented writer and a thinker. So he thought Paris would be the best place for him. Here is a clip of Jim's sister Anne talking about why Jim wanted to leave.
He did tell me one time he didn't want to sing Light My Fire again. He didn't want to do what the audiences wanted to hear from him. And when he wanted to do his poetry, they didn't want to listen. So I don't know if he thought fame was getting him what he wanted. I think Jim went to Paris to escape what he had in the United States, to gain his own freedom, allowing him to do his own writing and experience something new.
So Jim spends his days eating, drinking, writing poetry, going to the cinema, and walking around the neighborhoods of Paris, and he appears to be the happiest he's ever been. But he also seems to be curious about a horrible new habit courtesy of Pamela. Jim seems to be trying heroin for the first time here. Here's what it was like on his last day of Earth, according to his friend, Elaine Ronay. And Elaine and Jim were friends at UCLA Film School. Elaine is a French national, but he grew up in America. He and Jim met up in Paris when Jim moved there, and they became friends all over again. They would just spend their days hanging around the city. And Elaine's actually a very talented photographer, and he took all of these photos of Jim and Pamela right up until the week before they died. And they're really incredible to look at because Jim looks just amazing. On Friday, July 2nd, 1971, Elaine and Jim spend the day together sightseeing, drinking, and shopping. Jim wanted to buy Pamela a piece of jewelry and seemed to be extra needy for attention that day. Jim was usually good at keeping his anxieties at bay and not acting vulnerable around people or his friends, but Elaine noticed that Jim was extra needy, like I just said. He really wanted to be with a friend, and he would just openly say, "Please don't leave me, please don't leave me." He seemed scared to be left alone that day. So Elaine and Jim go to lunch, and Jim was interrupted with actually these violent bursts of hiccups, which is a sign of alcoholism, by the way. And the hiccups would cause him to shake violently, and he'd be gasping for air. He'd be causing this spectacle, and it happened everywhere they went that afternoon. At 5:30, Elaine tried to leave Jim because he already had another date planned, but Jim managed to talk him into a few more rounds of beer at a nearby pub. It was confusing for Elaine to see Jim this way because for the last few months in Paris, Jim had calmed down quite a bit. He was drinking, but he didn't seem to be taking any hard drugs that he knew of. He was also writing every day and taking better care of himself. He looked great. On that day, things seemed different. Jim goes home and convinces Pamela to go out to the movies. They go out to the movies. They come back. They're kind of laying around the apartment. Pamela says she went to bed, and then Jim went to bed later on and whatever. Here's the thing. It's a little convoluted, so I decided to bring in my friend Justin of American Crime Cast. They did a great segment about Jim on their show, and he has some really amazing insight. So take it away, Justin. Talk about Jim's last day on Earth and what people think happened to him that day.
Hey, everybody. This is Justin from American Crime Cast podcast, the former host of Mysterious Circumstances, and I am here today doing an interview about the great Jim Morrison. We have a couple conflicting stories from Pam Corson herself, which is the last person to see Jim Morrison alive. Actual versions that you will see in most documentaries is that a little bit later at night, they say at about 10 or 11, they return back to the apartment where they are watching 8mm films of their recent vacation to Morocco. At which point in time, Jim decides to try heroin for the first time. Now, Jim Morrison had usually stayed away from the hard stuff. There's a lot of conflicting stories about this from friends. He was scared to death of needles, so he decided to snort it. You'll get a couple of different stories about whether or not he accidentally snorted it, thinking it was cocaine, but from most accounts, not all of them, how it goes is that about 1 a.m., him and Pam decide to do some heroin. Now, Pam says that he tries heroin at this point in time to try to relax his spasms and, his respiratory problems and his hiccup fits that he's having. And they just relax and kick back. Now, at about 3:30 in the morning, they are laying together on the couch and they're asleep, and Pam wakes up to Jim Morrison he's struggling to breathe a little bit. Now, he says he's okay and says that he's going to draw a bath. She decides to go on to bed saying that he's, half-ass okay and, he's feeling all right. So she goes on to bed, and about 4 a.m., she wakes up and goes and checks on him, and she wakes up to the sound of him almost throwing up blood. This is one of the conflicting stories, because there's also another story that you can read in several places, to where she actually goes to bed, and at about between 3 and 5 a.m., hears Jim calling from the bathroom, "Pam, are you there? Pam, are you there?" In which she replies, "Yes, I'm here, Jim," and then doesn't hear any response. Now, in that version of events, you can see it written 3 different times by 3 different people in 20 different books. You get 5 a.m., 6 a.m., and 8 a.m. She wakes up to find Jim Morrison submerged in the bathtub. Her conflicting parts of the story are that he is actually submerged in the water, and she thinks that he's actually playing a trick on her. Now that specific part actually lines up with every story that you'll ever hear. The other half of it is when he's actually throwing up the blood, he tells her not to worry and to go back to bed, that he's going to be okay. So, of course, she goes back to bed. Now, at this point in the story, at 6 a.m. is when she actually finds his body. So we can naturally assume that probably at about 6 a.m. is when she actually finds his body, because that's the only thing that is consistent in almost all her stories. At which point in time, he is submerged under the water, like I had said, and she says that he has somewhat of a grin on his face. She thinks he's playing a prank, so she stands there for a few minutes and kind of like goes and touches him, and she realizes that he is not actually awake. She pulls him out of the water, realizes that he's not breathing, and freaks out. But she also states in this specific chain of events that she notices that there is dried blood and around his nose and his mouth, which, as we know, if he is submerged in a bathtub full of water, he's not going to have any kind of dry blood, anything around his mouth. Now, the first thing that she supposedly does, we hear 2 bits of information on it. One of them is that she actually calls her on-the-side boyfriend, because as much as those 2 loved each other, it was an on and off again relationship, and they did have, side partners, and her boyfriend on the side was actually her heroin dealer as well. Supposedly she calls him, asks what to do, because he has obviously OD'd on whatever he had done, supposedly. He says flush all the drugs, which there were no drugs found in the apartment whatsoever, which for a consistent heroin user is extremely rare. Flush all the drugs, and supposedly this guy, who does have a name, I'm not going to say it for legal purposes, he skips the country. I can't remember what country he actually went to, but he did not want anything to do with this, because this is Jim Morrison. So the next person, and this is actually a stated fact, the next person she calls, probably about a half an hour after she finds the body, so this is roughly about 6:30 a.m. in the morning, is Elaine Ronay, their friend. The reason she calls Elaine Ronay is because she is not fluent enough in French to actually call and any kind of fire department or ambulance or whatever and get them to come over as quick as they can. So the first 2 people on the scene are 2 firefighters. Now, in our episode that we did on Jim Morrison, we actually got in contact with a relative of one of the people on the scene, which was extremely cool. And some people are like, yeah, well, this person provided documents that are extremely real, so we know that they are not lying. And some of the facts, this is where some of the facts are really, really weird. Because the first 2 firefighters on the scene get there. The one states that Jim Morrison is out of the water, and there is dried blood and around his mouth and his nose, which is consistent with one of her stories. So, they check the pulse. They realize that he is obviously gone into, he has no pulse. But the thing about it that is weird is that this fireman actually states that they thought he had died extremely recently, within the last half hour, because the bath water was still warm. So his body was actually very, very warm. They pull him out, and I thought that was a very interesting fact because from the time he drew that bath till the time he was found, that water should not have been warm. So they pull him out, try to revive him. They really didn't know who he was. Now, Elaine Ronay is actually there at this point in time. Him and Pam are trying to, basically they're trying to tell everybody to keep this very, very quiet because of Jim Morrison's status. They don't want a media circus because at the end of the day, that's exactly what would have happened. So, he is legally declared dead.
Jim is buried July 7th at Père Lachaise, which was Elaine's idea, and there were only a handful of friends present. No family, no doors. And there's a lot of weirdness with Jim's death because there was no autopsy and very few people even saw his body before it was interred. So rumors have been flying around for many, many years afterwards that Jim was either murdered or he faked his own death. Once again, here's Justin. He's going to just talk about some of his favorite theories.
Well, we have a weird chain of events that happens, and this is where all the theories come into play. The main theory that people go by is that Jim Morrison had accidentally snorted heroin or tried it for the first time. The heroin was too strong. He had OD'd in the bathtub. Pamela Corson did not want to take responsibility for any of these actions, so she proceeds to try to do like a half-assed cover-up. Another small theory, which is a very popular one, and there's actually been 3 books written that coincide with this theory, is that Jim Morrison had actually left the apartment to buy more heroin for Pam Corson at a nightclub, at which point he tried the heroin in the bathroom. He had OD'd because the heroin was too strong and he was not a regular user. His body was found in the bathroom. The nightclub that he was at, or bar, whichever you want to call it, did not want anything to do with Jim Morrison dying in their bathroom. So they call up Pamela Corson, who in turn calls up Elaine Ronay and her heroin dealer. The body is taken to the apartment. It is drawn in a hot bath, at which point in time Elaine Ronay and Pam Corson call the medical authorities, in which point in time they show up. Another awesome theory, and my personal favorite because I am a fan, is that Jim Morrison faked his own death to get away from the spotlight. Now, a lot of people put this on the side as total BS, but there's actually a lot of strange things that happen because it's not out of the realm of possibilities. Jim Morrison did not want to be a rock star. Jim Morrison saw music as a tool to propel his poetry. He moved to Paris to work on his poetry. As much as he loved attention, he hated attention. He did not want to be a teen idol. That's why he grew out the beard. That's why he gained the weight. That's why he was drinking 40 beers a day, because he did not want to be that person. He wanted to be known for his writing, not for his looks, not for his stage presence. When he was in the spotlight as Jim Morrison from The Doors, he was not taken seriously as a poet. So he went to Paris, France. Now, at this point in time, he had a lot of things lined up to where he would be making money for the rest of his life, whether it be through The Doors or through the fact that he owned the rights to the word Zeppelin. He had worked out deals to straight up own this word, so basically anything that Led Zeppelin would put out, he would make money off of. Another, strange fact is he had an account in San Francisco, Bank of America. There was money drawn from this account just 2 weeks after he died. Now, Jim Morrison did not have to show ID when he went to this bank because they had his ID on file, in which they still do. From what I understand, they still have his identification on file, so he could literally walk in there whenever he wanted. Granted, that one's a little bit hard to believe because if Jim Morrison walks into a bank 2 weeks after he died, somebody's going to say something. But it's just weird because supposedly his body was wrapped in plastic, put on dry ice for 3 days after his death from the time his manager got to Paris to identify the body. By the time his manager got there, there was no body to be seen. He was already sealed in a casket, death certificate already signed. there was no autopsy done on the body. In Paris, France, at this point in time, anything that was, not thought of as a murder or anything suspicious, there was no autopsy done. The official cause of death was heart failure. So there was no reason to do an autopsy. Now, the only people to actually see Jim Morrison's body in his casket are Elaine Ronay and Pamela Corson, who very, very conveniently died 3 years later of a heroin overdose, and ironically enough, at the age of 27. Mm-hmm. So it's not too hard to believe all these different theories out there. It's really, really not.
I think for a lot of people, it's just kind of fun to imagine that Jim didn't really die and that he just took off someplace, Africa or the Caribbean or somewhere, and just lived a whole other life on his own terms. Even his own sister dreamt of that. But the fact is, most likely, Jim either died from a heroin overdose, either with Pamela at their apartment, or according to the 2007 French book titled The End, Jim Morrison, in a bathroom at a Parisian nightclub. So Sam Burnett, former manager of the Rock and Roll Circus nightclub, claims Jim bought heroin at his club, used it in the bathroom, and died right then and there. And somehow they snuck his body out of that place and returned it to his apartment. I have a hard time with that one because I think it would be really challenging to carry a 6-foot dead man around Paris, but what do I know? And honestly, does it even matter? The fact is, Jim was gone now. And his memory probably would have faded away like a lot of other rock stars before him and after him, except for one Doors superfan of all time, Danny Sugarman. Born October 11th, 1954, and Danny was just another preteen fan of the Doors when he got a job answering their fan mail. By 17, he was the Doors manager after Jim's death. And yes, they actually released a few albums after Jim died, but obviously they were just not that successful. In 1980, he co-wrote with Jerry Hopkins the book, No One Here Gets Out Alive. And let me tell you, as someone who was alive in the 80s, teenagers totally got into the Doors once again. Rolling Stone even gave Jim Morrison a cover that read, "He's hot, he's sexy, and he's dead." All true. And Danny pretty much spent the rest of his life off and on talking about Jim. Here he is on a local talk show in Southern California in the mid-1980s. It's pretty great.
And then when his wife Pamela and I hooked up, Jim's presence was in the room with us when the two of us were together. And getting high with her was just the natural thing to do. She was into heroin. Iggy Pop was into heroin. I had just done it and fallen in love with it, and it was around in the early 70s. Laurel Canyon, cocaine and heroin, 2 white powders were all over the place, and a lot of people died. When I finished No One Here Gets Out Alive, first Pamela Morrison had given me information on how Jim died, and while my collaborator was doing the book before I got involved, when she told me how Jim died, she knew I knew Jerry Hopkins, who I did the book with, and she made me promise her that I wouldn't tell him what she told me. And I did promise. I said I wouldn't ever tell anybody. No One Here Gets Out Alive was misunderstood to such an outrageous degree, and it's probably my fault, by implying that there's a chance Jim might be alive. But you have to understand, in No One Here Gets Out Alive, all I was doing was reporting on the versions of Jim's death that I knew of, and I certainly didn't invent the rumor that Jim might still be alive. As long as I was reporting the ways that Jim died, yes, he is dead, and here's the ways he might have died, and I list the theories, I felt it was also journalistically responsible to point out, on the other hand, there are those who won't have any of this. Jim is not dead, they claim, and I have to point out that this isn't as far-fetched as it might initially seem, because the guy had the exact type of personality that would stage his own death. He had the motivation to do it, he had the ability to do it, and he had the means to do it. He had the money, he had the reason, and he had the cause. He was up for jail time in Miami. The trial was going through appeals. He had the money to do it, and he was the type of personality that would do it. I didn't think that people would conclude that he had done it. You know, the message of No One Here Gets Out Alive is not that you can stage your own death and move to Africa and collect royalties for the rest of your life. You live like Jim Morrison, you die like Jim Morrison. The only reason I'm still here is stupid luck. I am certainly no smarter than him. I'm certainly no stronger than him.
Sadly, Danny passed away to cancer on January 5th, 2005. One last cultural touchstone I want to mention this show is the Doors movie. I mentioned at the top of the show. I also mentioned I think this movie is amazing and dumb and brilliant and silly and just so much fun most of the time. And like I said, I was an extra in this movie when I was a crazy teen from Northern California. So it was filmed in Northern California. There was this outdoor concert scene. There's the one outdoor concert scene, and we were there all night long. And I have to tell you, being in the audience, we thought Val Kilmer was amazing. He looked like Jim. He sounded like Jim. He was really sexy and swaggering. And the one thing that was weird was that there's a scene in the movie, if you've ever seen it, there are these naked dancers dancing around a bonfire. So I was there when they filmed that, and the bonfire happened behind us, the audience. And so we're facing the stage and we're watching the band, and then the dancers are behind us. And you're not going to believe this, but like every crew member came out to just stare at these people because they were dancing naked. It was a little creepy. So as far as the movie goes itself, I think Val Kilmer actually looks and sounds an awful lot like Jim, and I think pretty much all of us can agree upon that. But honestly, I think like Oliver Stone and a lot of people are just obsessed with his sexy image and his swagger. But deep down, Jim was actually kind of nerdy. He was very intelligent. He was very awkward, really shy, and he was very loyal to his friends. And people said when he wasn't drinking and he wasn't drunk, he was a very sweet person. And we never get to know that person in this movie, which is such a shame. And the movie stars a lot of really talented people like Kilmer. We have Frank Whaley. We have one of my favorite character actors, Michael Wincott. But we also get an improbably cast Meg Ryan as Pamela Corson. And apparently Meg thought Pamela was just an early version of a yuppie. And if she had existed in the 80s, she would have done much better. And that's not true. We all know that. She plays her basically as the most sunniest heroin addict in the world. The bathtub scene at the very end of the movie is so strangely bland, and we have no real feeling attached to it because we never get to know the real Jim, which is a shame because, like I said, he was actually a really interesting guy and very sweet when he wasn't drunk. Anyway, I just want to close out this episode by giving the last words to Steve and Ann, and they're talking about Jim's final legacy.
Yeah, I was impressed with the fact that here is my son being interred really quite honorably into the great cemetery in Paris, and made you realize how well known and how well liked he was.
My dad thought for a long time, he took it very seriously what he was going to put on the grave.
I went back to my Greek teacher and I said, what we're looking for is something for the gravestone, which sums up his philosophy.
So he put in Greek, true to his own destiny or true to his own spirit. And I thought that was just the perfect thing to put on his tombstone.
And he went his own way, and he was true to his own ambition, to his own aspirations. And that was his goal in life, and he made it.
I would like him to be remembered for his poetry and his music and his living his life his way.
Well, basically, he was a good man. He's a good, solid citizen. He had moral and ethical standards that were very high, and I think he was just somebody you would like to know.
So thank you for checking out today's show. See you next time. And if you want to be part of the Not Fade Away podcast in the future, well, did you see someone famous live? Did you know someone famous like that in the music industry who's no longer with us? Reach out to me. Send me a tweet or Facebook or whatever, Instagram, whatever, at Not Fade Away Podcast. Reach me there or send me an email, notfadeawaypodcast@gmail.com. Now for the closing credits. Thank you for listening to the Not Fade Away podcast. And if you like what you hear, please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. And if you love what you hear, yay, please leave a review. It helps us so much more than you could ever know. You can follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at Not Fade Away Podcast. You can email us with comments or suggestions to notfadeawaypodcast@gmail.com. And if you want to learn more about my other shows, Book vs. Movie, The Fit Bottom Girls, and the Best Neighbors podcast, just follow me at Brooklyn Fit Chick on all social media or check out my main blog, brooklynfitchick.com. Thanks so much. Go out there and kick ass today.